Imagine stepping into a world where tempers burn hotter than the arena lights, and one wrong word can spark a war that echoes for decades. That world is professional wrestling behind the curtain, where egos, pride, and power collide. And at the very center of so many of those collisions stands one man, Jim Cornette. A sharp tongue, a sharper mind, and a personality so combustible that nearly everyone who crossed him ended up on one side of a feud. But among all those battles, one story rises above the rest. A story about respect, rebellion, and the moment Cornette nearly lost everything because of a future world champion. Jim Cornette wasn't just another loudmouth manager or commentator. In the late 90s and early 2000s, he was trusted with something sacred, the responsibility of molding the next generation of superstars in Ohio Valley Wrestling, WWE's developmental territory. To Cornette, wrestling wasn't a joke. It wasn't a game. It was a tradition, a craft that demanded respect. He treated the business with almost religious seriousness, and that's why he clashed so violently with anyone who dared to treat it otherwise. But no one tested his patience more than a young athlete named Brock Lesnar. When Brock first walked into OVW, everyone knew he was different. He was a freak of nature, 6'3", nearly 300 pounds of raw muscle, and an NCAA wrestling champion. To most, he looked like the perfect future star. But to Cornette, something was missing. Beneath the powerful physique and natural ability, Brock carried himself with an arrogance that didn't sit well with the locker room. He showed respect only to Cornette and Danny Davis, the coaches who held authority. But to referees, ring crew, and anyone he thought beneath him, he was a bully. And that bullying reached a boiling point one night when Cornette's personal life became part of the story. Cornette's girlfriend at the time, Stacy, worked as an on-screen manager. During one segment, Cornette booked a spot where Brock had to press slam Stacy inside the ring. It seemed simple enough until Brock learned about her new intimate piercings. Instead of treating the move with caution, he turned it into a cruel joke. All day, he teased that he was going to grab her the wrong way. And when the moment came, he did exactly that. He squeezed her between the legs, leaving her screaming in pain before the crowd. What was supposed to be a harmless wrestling move had turned into humiliation, and backstage, Stacy was furious. The confrontation that followed could have changed wrestling history. Stacy and Brock argued until Cornette himself stepped in. What Brock didn't realize was that Cornette wasn't the kind of man to back down. He could tolerate disrespect to himself, but not to the people he cared about. And when Brock mouthed off, telling Stacy, "You," right in front of Cornette, the air in the room turned heavy. Cornette didn't shout. He didn't throw a punch. Instead, he looked straight at the man who would one day become the Beast incarnate and told him something chilling. "I won't fight you. I'll shoot you." That wasn't a figure of speech. Cornette meant it. He knew Brock was too big, too strong, too genetically gifted to fight in a fistfight. But Cornette also knew that if Brock pushed the wrong person far enough, someone might not fight him at all. Someone might pull a gun. In Cornette's mind, Brock wasn't untouchable. He was just reckless enough to meet the wrong fate. And in that moment, Cornette was dead serious about being the one to deliver it. The threat shocked everyone. This wasn't just wrestling drama. This was real. A trainer threatening to shoot his own student over a backstage altercation. In a business filled with staged violence, this was no act. And whether Brock believed him or not, he never forgot it. Not long after, Brock left OVW early, citing a pregnant girlfriend back home. 6 months later, he was on WWE television, performing at a level Cornette felt was a slap in the face to all the hardworking guys still in developmental. To Cornette, Brock had coasted through training, half-hearted until the big money came, and that betrayal burned almost as much as the disrespect. From that day forward, Cornette never had a kind word for Brock Lesnar. He recognized his talent, sure. He admitted Brock was a once-in-a-lifetime athlete, but to him, Brock was also a bully, a meathead, and a man who never truly respected the business that had given him everything. Cornette didn't just dislike him, he resented him, and he let the world know it every chance he got. The Brock Lesnar feud became one of the earliest chapters in a long list of Cornette's legendary battles. But here's the thing about Jim Cornette. Brock wasn't the only one who lit that fire. Over the years, others would cross him in ways just as infuriating. Some thought wrestling was just comedy. Some thought it was just entertainment. And to Cornette, that was the greatest insult of all. Which is why one night, years later, when a young wrestler dared to laugh at the wrong time, Cornette's anger didn't just spark, it exploded in front of an entire locker room. But what exactly happened that night, and how did one rookie's laughter almost end his career before it even began? Picture this, a wrestling arena in Kentucky, packed with screaming fans. The lights dim, the music hits, and out comes a monster of a man known as the Boogeyman. His gimmick was designed to terrify the audience, face paint, wild eyes, and worms hanging from his mouth. In the crowd that night, a few developmental wrestlers had been handpicked to play along, to act scared and sell the illusion. It was a test of commitment, of respect for the craft. But one man didn't play along. Instead of looking terrified, he laughed. He thought it was all a joke. That man was a young Italian wrestler who would later be known to the world as Santino Marella. At that moment, though, he wasn't a star. He was just another rookie learning the ropes. And to Jim Cornette, his laughter wasn't just disrespect, it was a crime against the business itself. Backstage, Cornette's blood boiled. To him, wrestling wasn't comedy, and the Boogeyman's act, no matter how bizarre, deserved the same respect as anything else in the show. So when Cornette found out who the laughing rookie was, he demanded Santino be brought to him immediately. The locker room gathered, whispering because they all knew what was coming. Cornette towered over Santino and asked, "Why didn't you run from the Boogeyman?" Santino, nervous but not fully aware of the storm he had unleashed, muttered, "Nobody told me I should run." That answer was the spark that lit the dynamite. Without warning, Cornette slapped him across the face, hard enough to leave the entire locker room stunned. In Cornette's eyes, the slap was a lesson, a punishment, a reminder that this business was to be treated with respect, not laughter. But in WWE's eyes, it was unacceptable. Word traveled fast, and before long, Cornette was gone from OVW. The man who lived and breathed wrestling tradition had let his temper cost him the very job he loved. And the bitter irony? Years later, Santino Marella would debut on WWE television, playing a comedy character, the exact kind of act Cornette despised. To Jim Cornette, it felt like salt in the wound. He often mocked Santino as someone who never truly belonged in the wrestling business. And when the two crossed paths again years later at a wrestling convention, the tension was still alive. Words were exchanged, tempers flared, and it nearly came to blows all over again. Cornette's hatred didn't die with time, it burned brighter. But Santino wasn't the only man who drew Cornette's wrath. There was another, far more dangerous feud waiting just around the corner. A feud not with a comedy act, but with one of the most violent men wrestling had ever seen, New Jack. New Jack wasn't like the others. He was unpredictable, dangerous, and known for crossing lines most wrestlers wouldn't even approach. When Cornette first saw him on the independent circuit in the early 90s, he recognized his talent immediately, especially his ability to talk. Cornette signed him to Smoky Mountain Wrestling, a regional promotion he owned at the time, and gave him opportunities most wrestlers only dreamed of. Matches with top stars, big paydays, and a platform to build his name. For a while, it worked, but soon things fell apart. Cornette eventually cut ties with New Jack, and when Paul Heyman offered him a spot in ECW, the transition turned sour. Instead of quietly moving on, New Jack began cutting promos on Cornette, blasting him publicly on ECW television. To Cornette, it wasn't just betrayal, it was personal. He had given New Jack a chance, treated him fairly, and in return, he got stabbed in the back on national TV. And behind it all, Cornette saw the shadow of Paul Heyman. Heyman, the mastermind of ECW, had a reputation for manipulating talent, for making promises that sometimes never came true. Cornette didn't just feel betrayed by New Jack, he felt double-crossed by Heyman himself. And that fueled a hatred that never really cooled down. Cornette later described Paul Heyman as a pathological liar, a man who would rather climb a tree and tell a lie than stand on the ground and tell the truth. He wasn't just angry, he was disgusted. In Cornette's eyes, Heyman didn't just manipulate wrestlers, he ruined lives. And for Cornette, a man who treated wrestling as sacred, that was unforgivable. These incidents, Brock Lesnar's arrogance, Santino's laughter, New Jack's betrayal, and Heyman's lies, weren't isolated moments. They were part of a pattern. Time and again, Cornette found himself at war with people who didn't see wrestling the way he did. To him, wrestling was about logic, respect, and tradition. To others, it was about entertainment, money, or chaos. And every time those two visions clashed, Cornette was ready to fight. But if you think Brock, Santino, or New Jack pushed Cornette to the edge, none of them compare to the one man who would become his greatest enemy. A man whose name still makes Cornette's blood boil. A man whose vision for wrestling stood in direct opposition to everything Cornette believed in. His name? Vince Russo. And when Cornette and Russo collided, the result wasn't just a feud, it was all-out war. Every great story has a villain. For Jim Cornette, that villain was not a wrestler, not a promoter, not even a bully like Brock Lesnar, or a disrespectful rookie like Santino. No, Cornette's greatest enemy was a man behind the scenes. A man with a pen, not a pair of boots. His name was Vince Russo. To understand why Cornette despised Russo, you need to understand their two visions of wrestling. Cornette believed in logic, storytelling, and athletic competition. To him, wrestling was like theater, yes, but theater grounded in realism. The audience had to believe what they were seeing could be real. Russo, on the other hand, was the architect of the Attitude Era, the man who filled WWF programming with swerves, wild storylines, and shock value. He borrowed from movies, TV dramas, and soap operas. And while ratings soared under his chaotic style, Cornette saw it as the death of everything wrestling was supposed to be. By 1997, the two men were working together on WWF's creative team, and from the start, it was a nightmare. Cornette looked at Russo as a fraud, a man who didn't understand the business but had wormed his way into power. He mocked Russo for basing storylines on bad movies he rented from his video store days. Cornette claimed that the moment the wrestling bell rang, Russo was lost, like a deer in headlights. And as Russo's influence grew, Cornette's rage grew with it. Years later, when both men ended up in TNA, Cornette thought he was safe. Russo had already been fired once, but then came the phone call. Dutch Mantel told him, "We made some changes. We fired everyone, except me and Jeff, and we hired one guy, Vince Russo." Cornette's blood ran cold. It was his worst nightmare all over again. He wanted to quit immediately. But Jeff Jarrett convinced him to stay, promising he wouldn't have to work directly with Russo. For a while, Cornette endured it, gritting his teeth as the scripts became more outrageous every week. But eventually, he couldn't stomach it anymore. By 2009, TNA cut ties with Cornette after he openly refused to support Russo's creative direction. The fallout didn't stop there. Months later, Cornette sent an email so filled with anger, it was described as a terroristic threat. In it, he said he wanted Russo dead. TNA's lawyers took it seriously, warning Cornette that one more threat could bring law enforcement into the picture. Cornette never backed down, never apologized. To this day, he says nothing would give him more satisfaction than swinging a baseball bat at Russo's skull. But Vince Russo wasn't the only one Cornette warred with in those years. In Ring of Honor, another battle was brewing, this time with Kevin Owens, then known as Kevin Steen. Cornette saw Owens as a phenomenal talent, both in the ring and on the microphone. But to Cornette, talent wasn't enough. Owens wrestled in gym shorts and a t-shirt. He carried extra weight. He didn't look, in Cornette's eyes, like a world champion. Cornette begged him to clean up his image, to dress better, to present himself like a star. But Owens resisted, pushing back at every suggestion. The two clashed not only over presentation, but also over philosophy. Owens loved hardcore matches, ladders, and chaos. Cornette wanted structure, realism, and tradition. To Owens, Cornette was stuck in the past. To Cornette, Owens was disrespecting the business. Their feud became infamous in ROH, a microcosm of Cornette's lifelong struggle, tradition versus change. Jim Cornette is not perfect. His temper cost him jobs. His words made him enemies for life. But love him or hate him, one thing is undeniable. He never compromised on his beliefs. To Cornette, wrestling wasn't just a business, it was a way of life, and he would rather lose everything than watch that life be disrespected. As the years passed, Many of his rivals went their own way. Brock Lesnar became a global star. Santino Marella made millions making fans laugh. New Jack became a legend of ultraviolence. Kevin Owens proved himself on the biggest stage, and Vince Russo, he remains one of the most controversial figures in wrestling history. But Cornette, he's still here, still talking, still swinging at anyone who dares to challenge his vision. Maybe that's why fans remain fascinated with him. He's not just a manager, not just a booker, not just a podcaster. He's a lightning rod. A man whose feuds are as legendary as the wrestlers he managed. So here's the question. Was Jim Cornette right all along to defend tradition at all costs? Or was he just a man trapped in the past, unable to see that wrestling, like everything else, had to evolve? That's for you to decide.